British concert pianist Steven Osborne is in demand as a soloist and chamber musician throughout the world. He won first prize at the Naumburg International Competition and the Clara Haskell Competition, and he's won many awards for his recordings. And I'm delighted he's taken the time to join me here today in Buckinghamshire for a classical conversation. Welcome.
Hi.
Lovely to be chatting to you today.
Thank you, good to be here.
I'm going to start by asking you all about your musical education, how old you were when you started, what was the catalyst, and whether you come from a musical family.
Yeah, well, my dad, neither of my parents were musicians, but my dad played organ at the local church and sort of roundabout different places. He was a very musical man. He sometimes would improvise on the piano, just noodling around, and it was always really beautiful. We had a piano in the house when I was as tall as I could reach the keys. I started picking tunes out. And I somehow really remember that. I got a lot of pleasure out of it. And I started getting lessons when I was 4, I think, maybe 5. So I don't know, it was something that I was always drawn to. I never used to sleep very much as a kid. I'd wake up very early and I would go straight downstairs and start playing the piano at 4:30 in the morning. Poor Dad would come down and tell me to stop. And finally I had to put a notice on the piano saying, please don't play the piano before 7:30. Terrible, those hours just sitting around waiting.
So which teachers do you think then were crucial in your development?
Well, I got different things from different teachers. When I was at St Mary's Music School in Edinburgh, from 10 to 17, I was with Richard Beecham, a New Zealand man, very into relaxation, trying to find a good way of working with the body. He was very interested in physiology.
Okay.
So that kind of was an underpinning to the way he taught. When I was at music college, I was with Rena Calloway, South African, but her education had been in Europe, in Amsterdam particularly, but I can't remember elsewhere. She played for Clara Haskell actually a bit, so kind of very strong European tradition in her teaching, which was all about beauty of sound, singing line, cleanliness of approach, and not using the pedal to cover over a multitude of sins. And actually just simple technical work. I did a lot of technical work with her, which I really needed. So probably in terms of the, how do you say, in terms of the real practical influence and what my playing sounds like, she probably had the greatest influence because she really moulded things technically. But there was other teachers I played for that were very influential. Actually, I played for Charles Rosen a few times. And it's in a way not so much as teaching, but just interacting with him. He's such an amazing man, incredible musical mind, just absolutely cutting through sort of various kinds of confusion, just an incredibly clear sort of view of things, which you can agree with or disagree with. It was incredibly stimulating. There was a Brazilian man, Arnaldo Cohen, who's also a really wonderful pianist. He's a really amazing teacher, able to teach in extreme detail and also in this broadest, question of dealing with ideas. And it's not very often you get teachers that can really work well in both those areas. Beyond that, I have to mention my old head of music. He wasn't my piano teacher, he was a violinist, Nigel Murray, at St Mary's Music School, but he was just an amazing man. Somebody that loved music so much, just had this absolutely infectious love of it, and he was the conductor for the school orchestra, and technically, may not have been the greatest conductor, but he just drew you in so much, the experience of making music with these people around you.
What about developing your technique? How did you do that? Were you a churny practicer?
Rena put me through all those kind of things. I guess probably Cherry was this kind of thing we started off with, and then there's a lot of Brahms exercises, and partly doing things through, picking particular pieces with technical problems. I mean, to be honest, I'm not really quite sure how it all worked, because I do very little teaching myself, and I've never had to build someone's technique up like that. So I've not really seen that process of you give people these things and this is what comes out of it.
Right.
But I remember suddenly Actually, there's one thing I do remember very clearly. It's this brand exercise that goes like this. I remember practicing that for a couple of weeks and suddenly noticing my hand looked different. It was really fascinating that this was suddenly...
Fourth and fifth started to...
Well, no, it was, my knuckles were suddenly more pronounced. I thought, that's weird. That's the only thing I can really point to of actually seeing something change. And, I mean, apart from anything else, it just made me much physically stronger in my fingers. And if you're going to play in a big hall, you need to be strong.
So you won 2 major competitions. How did they shape and change your career, do you think?
I mean, in a couple of ways. Firstly, you know, it's a kind of catch-22 thing. In order to get better at playing concerts, you have to play concerts. So it was incredibly useful just to have a few concerts coming out of that, out of winning the competitions, and so you're just more steps along the way of gradually feeling what it's like to be on stage and you know, trying to negotiate the questions of nerves and how new repertoire and all this stuff. But also, when I won the first competition, Clara Haskell, that made it much easier to get an agent. It was something which people could look at and think, oh well, there is some kind of sign of approval from someone else. And it wasn't that long after that that I started working with my manager.
Right. So which composers do you really love to play?
Oh God, there's so many. I mean, it's so lucky for piano, the breadth of repertoire, that you couldn't really get through all the masterpieces that there are in a lifetime. Certainly Ravel, certainly Beethoven, Rachmaninoff, Messiaen, Schubert. Those are the ones that I really have this incredibly strong visceral reaction to. Okay, that's something I absolutely love. I love the Mozart, certainly. Michael Tippett.
I was just about to ask you about the Tippett, because your recording was nominated for a BBC Music Magazine Award, so what kind of attracted you to that style? It's quite a brittle style, isn't it?
Well, it's very varied. I mean, Tippett was a composer whose ambition sometimes exceeded his technical ability to realise it. You know, certainly in his operas, he's trying to deal with very weighty themes of existence. There's even the piece The Mask of Time is trying to, how do you say, condense the entire history of the universe into this one piece. And the music doesn't always quite live up to that billing. But, I mean, for me, the instrumental music is actually the best part of his output, for all that he's most famous for the operas. He has very much like Beethoven, he confronts things head on. And he sort of tends to set up kind of structure which is asking certain questions. That second piano sonata, it's very disjointed. It's like it's asking the question, what happens if you never let the momentum develop and you're always just cutting from one thing to another? And he was going to call it mosaics, actually. So it's a very sort of striking arrangement of things that just cut from one to the other. I mean, so the structure's, again, as with Beethoven, the structure's incredibly important. The structure's a big part of what the piece says. But he's also capable of incredible lyricism in the best of his music. And I just find there's a grittiness to it that I really respond to. And it's not easy for the listener. I mean, certainly, particularly the later music, it can seem a bit impenetrable, but I find it really, really... I mean, even when I started learning those later sonatas, I'm like, what is there in these? And I asked a friend who played the last piano sonata, it's actually rewarding to play. And he said, oh, it's amazing to play. So I thought, okay.
Gives you encouragement.
Yeah, exactly.
You recently performed the Messiaen Span Regarded. I think it was the Queen Elizabeth Hall, but you've recorded it as well. Beautiful, such complex and intellectual, demanding music. What significance does this piece have for you, and how do you create unity in playing the whole piece?
I mean, it's a very interesting piece in terms of how the audience respond to it, because, you know, still now a lot of people are nervous about 20th century music, later 20th century music, because they think it's going to be ugly or whatever. And so often, I mean, I think probably literally every concert where I play that piece, someone comes up to me and says, God, I enjoyed that so much more than I expected I was going to. there's something about Messiaen's style, when he was writing at that time, mid-1940s, there's a very direct emotional effect of the music, even in the very complex stuff. He has the widest contrasts of just about any composer, from incredibly quiet to incredibly loud, to extremely gentle to the most violent. So that's part of the reason that the piece can sustain itself over, it's over 2¼ hours. Well, no, it's about 2¼ hours. So it's got an absolutely massive canvas which he fills with this wildly varied landscape.
And you don't have an interval, do you?
No, personally I prefer playing it without an interval. I mean, there is a point in the middle after the 10th piece in which it would you could naturally take a break. But it might be worth just saying a little bit about the piece. It's Van Regards sur l'Enfant Jésus, 20 Contemplations of the Child Jesus. Messiaen was a very devout Catholic. So all of this kind of music is written as a believer, you could say, in the way that Bach wrote his Passions. And yeah, so these pieces are, as if different characters looking at the child Jesus, God the Father, looking at him, the Holy Spirit. And then there's various abstract things like time, or silence, or the heaven and stuff. It's just an astonishing work. Again, actually, the structure of it, and how he creates, well, you were asking about unity, I mean, in many ways it's written into the piece. There are certain themes that come back. There's one theme in particular, which begins the piece, also ends the piece, and comes back in different guises in the middle of it. The main theme, the theme of God, goes like this. Something very beautiful, very gentle, but it starts actually even much slower than that, like this. So this incredibly spacious effect. So when it comes back during the piece, generally it's quite contemplative like that. But even in the penultimate piece, it comes back even simpler than that. He takes literally this chord and simply sits on the one chord. And I've not stopped, the piece is still going at that point. It's an astonishing idea that when I first looked at that piece, that particular one, I thought this couldn't possibly work because there's so little in it. And yet somehow, I mean, Messiaen's famous for writing very, very slow metronome marks. Again, like the extremes of what he goes for. There's a story that in the quartet for the end of time, the cellist came to him to ask him about, there's a movement for cello and piano, which is more semi-quaver, equals, I can't remember what number, 60 maybe, or it might be slower. No, it's quite a bit slower. I can't remember what number it is. The cellist said, you don't really mean it to go at this tempo, do you? And Messiaen said, no, slower. Supposedly.
You play a lot of French music, I noticed. You do evening recitals of Ravel, and your recording of Debussy's Clinical Preludes has been really highly acclaimed. What is it that you love so much about Impressionism?
Sound. I mean, what it does to make the piano sound not like a piano. You know, because in many ways, this simple sound of a piano is quite uninteresting. I don't know, it's always a challenge of how you get it to sound either orchestral or how you create some kind of sonic effects with it, so that there's, I mean, even just creating a sense of line on piano is such a fiction. To hear this, you can sort of almost imagine the notes are joined in a legato line, but really looking on a computer what they sound like.
Yes.
This. But so for French music particularly, yeah, it's just so lovely.
Yes.
Beautiful kind of world. I mean, I think for Ravel, it's not only sound, of course. I mean, there's the particular, for want of a better word, attitude of composers. I mean, in Ravel's music, there is so much emotion under the surface. A kind of melancholy, it seems to me, looking back to childhood. Something about it that I find very compelling. Is it particularly Ravel's music? Debussy, in a way, is more exploratory. I don't know. I find it harder to really put my finger on what it is about Debussy that I love, but there is an absolutely amazing sort of openness in some way to not controlling where the music goes, to just see what happens, and he keeps finding these amazing things.
What are the greatest challenges involved in being a concert pianist?
I don't know. I mean, certainly logistically, it can be tricky. I mean, actually, one of the main things is simply that you're taken away from your family a lot, and in personal terms, it's very hard. A lot of musicians. I mean, particularly if you've got two musicians married that are both travelling a lot,
yes.
That's incredibly difficult. But even if there's one's travelling a lot and the other isn't, then one person's left at home and the other one's travelling a lot. That's very difficult. I mean, in terms of the actual job itself, I mean, it's tiring, travelling a lot, but you can't really complain about that because it's so nice getting to see these places. In terms of the actual playing, I mean, learning, assimilating complex pieces can be very difficult on the brain. You need to have enough time.
I was about to say, especially quickly, I would imagine, if you haven't
very
little time to learn things.
I mean, after I learned all the typical piano music, I quite significantly changed how I worked because I had to learn a lot quite quickly, and it was so complex that I didn't learn anything for a year after that, or maybe more, because I needed a break. And so then I started making sure there weren't too many pieces at the same time. I'd learn, and actually it's much more enjoyable that way anyway, because it's horrible having this feeling that you're having to force
yes.
the stuff into your fingers. And then you'd have time to assimilate, actually, what does the music mean? What is it that you want to do with it?
What exciting plans have you got for the future?
Well, it's all pieces that I'm learning. The Hammer Clavier Sonata, I'm doing that for the first time in a couple of months. That's looming large. Yeah, it's really just pieces, different pieces. Beethoven Second Piano Concerto, the Rachmaninoff Etude Tableau. But talking about getting things into your fingers, that's going to be a big,
that'll be fun.
big job. Yeah, I don't know, that would be it.
What does playing the piano mean to you?
I'd say it feels just utterly natural. It feels like the most natural way of expressing myself, maybe. And it feels an incredible privilege to make a living relating to these works, which are some of the greatest things that humankind has produced. It's such a privilege working in an area which constantly keeps bringing you back to yourself. That you have to feel in order to play this stuff. Or in order for it to work. In order for the audience to be involved, you have to feel. So in working with this stuff, you're discovering more about your emotional life almost automatically if you engage with the music. And it's just an incredibly lucky thing to be doing, because if you're working in a factory or something, if there's nothing of interest in your job, it must be very difficult to actually stay switched on.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Steve.
Welcome.
Thank you.